Bet Sharukkin, the Son of Perdition, by Alan Bonk. Chapter 7. NATO the Spearhead. In the television news studio of a BBC news show, which was similar to Larry King Live, the British interviewer begins. Welcome back. Before the advertisement break, we were talking with General Clark of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So, back to our topic. I have an excerpt here from the Jerusalem Post, which says NATO has moved a special military force into the Middle East in an attempt to stabilize the region from descending into a warlord feudal system. This force is called the Rapid Deployment Force, correct? General Clark replied, yes. It is a very robust and dynamic and consists of, and the interviewer interrupted. Many refer to them as the head of the spear. The general glosses over the comment and adds, it consists of forces from 10 NATO member and partner nations, 5 from Europe and 5 from the Middle East, including Turkey. They consist of 10 commanders or generals which understand situational tactics and know how to respond to dynamic circumstances. These commanders operate with near autonomy when in the battle theater. It seems to me like the 5 commanders from the Muslim nations are an attempt to make sure that the Muslims do not feel like this is an occupying force from Europe. You know, crusaders, the interviewer remarked. I have to admit that the force is being resisted by many in the region because they are not comfortable with a purely military force without any direct, real-time civilian oversight. We are currently looking for someone that is acceptable to everyone involved. This will not be easy, the general added. Just a few days later, Paul, outside his Nineveh office, was being interviewed by a TV news crew. The question has been asked, who would be acceptable to both Jews and Muslims, the reporter stated. I understand the Muslim concerns because of my position in the Iranian government, but I'm not a Muslim, but rather a Christian. And more than that, I'm an Assyrian, a Semite, Paul remarked. It seems you are someone that both Jews and Muslims respect, as well as a man highly regarded in Iran and now in Iraq. It's easy to see how your name was brought forth, said the reporter. Oh, you're too kind. This comment gets a legitimate laugh from the others in the room. Paul continued, so, as I was saying, NATO has approached me, and it was really an easy answer. I accepted the position. This is what my father would have wanted. Paul sent a knowing glance at Father Ibrahim, who was standing against the back wall. Thank you again for your time, sir. I wish you all the best, and good luck with your new position in NATO, remarked the reporter. Paul turned to the cameras with a wide shark-like grin. The cameras flashed. NATO headquarters in Brussels, Belgium. Paul was conducting a briefing for the international news media. This was after all of his tasks and directions had been established by NATO. Paul was at the podium, and again, lights were flashing. Paul stated, The first task I will undertake is to get all the nations in the area which still have functioning governments to agree to allow my NATO forces to be the only military force operating in the area. All military or paramilitary units will have to stand down and disarm. The international and local journalists recorded and took notes. It's a mixed bag of reactions. Paul continued, in exchange, NATO will provide security to all nations. I repeat, all nations in the Levant, without any action being taken based on race or religion. We will simply provide security for all concerned. This security agreement will be a temporary arrangement, which will be reassessed at the end of 7 years. We believe that this is a sufficient time to start rebuilding and establishing home rule governments. He continued, NATO forces would have the right to enter into and inspect any nation at any time unannounced and remain there until any civil unrest is mitigated. They can also keep, if necessary, garrisons within any nation they choose. The media burst into questions. An overwhelming situation. Paul just smiled, put his hands in the air, turned and walked away. The technique he learned from the priests in Urmia so many years ago. It worked in Brussels as well. Paul spent the next 2 weeks reviewing his forces, which were already deployed in the Levant in the Middle East. He traveled with his 10 commanders and their support staff. He entered and consulted with all the nations and their leadership. He was amazed at how robust his forces were. They were the best NATO had to offer. They intimidated everyone who saw them. Paul liked it most when they saluted him. Paul finished his tour and returned home to Nineveh. He was in a new office built by NATO within the old Nineveh walls. It was separate but adjacent to his Assyrian government offices. Paul didn't think much of it. He said it has no class, no taste. But Father Ibrahim reminded him that no one else in the world holds the position that he does, and that offices come and go. The priest promised him that the next one will be better. Later, a NATO officer stood in front of Paul reading updates from the Levant. The NATO officer announced Kuwait, the UAE, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and even Oman have all accepted the terms very quickly. But, Paul asked, the officer continued, Iraq, Egypt, and Israel did not just jump on board. These nations have a lot to lose by allowing their militaries to be dismantled or put into mothballs for 7 years. Paul looks at Father Ibrahim, who sat at the back of the office, monitoring. Father Ibrahim spoke to the officer. Iraq will bend very soon to American pressure. Please add that to your report for tomorrow's meeting. The officer flinched and frowned. This comment from a priest was a break in protocol, and he didn't quite know how to take it. He looked at Paul for direction. Paul simply nodded his approval. It's clear that this priest does more than taking confessions. He looks like a priest, but he talks like a general. You can go, exclaimed the priest. Thank you for your efforts. Have a good evening, Paul remarked. The officer saluted and left. Father Ibrahim moved over to Paul's desk and sat directly across from him, and with a very direct look said Israel and Egypt will not be so easily shaken. Don't worry. I have a bargaining chip for Israel, Paul replied. You know what you must do. Yes, even if I have to call on all of my powers, I will get the answers I want. I will not be deterred, Paul stated. End of chapter 7.